Lesson 9. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Memory text. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. Psalms 118, verses 22 and 23. Psalms contain numerous prophecies about the coming Messiah, Jesus Christ. These prophecies include descriptions of the Messiah's suffering, death, resurrection, and exaltation. Many psalms speak of redemption, salvation, and deliverance, which can be seen as pointing towards Jesus' work of redemption through his death and resurrection. Several psalms depict the righteous sufferer who endures trials and persecution, but ultimately finds vindication and deliverance. We see parallels between these depictions and the suffering and triumph of Jesus Christ. The Psalms are a rich source of prophecy, worship, and reflection that point to the person and work of Jesus Christ as the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises and purposes.
Divine self-sacrificing shepherd. Psalm chapter 23 portrays the relationship between the Lord and his people in several intimate and comforting ways. The psalm begins with the image of the Lord as a shepherd and his people as his sheep. The Lord provides care, guidance, and protection for his followers. The shepherd takes care of his flock, leading them to green pastures and quiet waters, symbolizing sustenance, rest, and peace. The Lord is depicted as a provider and protector. He ensures that his people have all they need, guiding them through both peaceful and challenging times. Even in the valley of the shadow of death, the psalmist trusts in the Lord's protection and presence. The Lord's presence is comforting and reassuring, even in the midst of difficulties. The Lord's rod and staff, symbols of authority and protection, offer guidance and assurance to his people. The imagery shifts slightly as the psalmist describes the Lord as a gracious host who prepares a table before his people, symbolizing abundance and provision. The Lord's goodness and mercy follow his people throughout their lives, and they are assured of dwelling in his house forever, indicating an eternal relationship and security in his presence. Many other psalms also portray a deeply personal and intimate relationship between the Lord and his people. This is characterized by care, guidance, protection, provision, and eternal fellowship. It reflects the trust and confidence that believers place in God's loving care, even amidst life's uncertainties and challenges. Just as a shepherd leads and guides his flock to safe pastures and sources of water, God leads his people along righteous paths. The shepherd protects his flock from danger and harm. Psalms emphasizes the everlasting relationship between God and his people, characterized by his goodness, love, and the promise of Jesus. Jesus, as our good shepherd, enables anyone to follow him to an eternal dwelling in his presence. John chapter 10 verse 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep.
The suffering Messiah. Psalm chapter 22 is often interpreted as a prophetic portrayal of the suffering and redemption of Jesus Christ. In the Gospels, there are several parallels between the events described in Psalm chapter 22 and the experiences of Jesus during his crucifixion. My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" is echoed by Jesus on the cross in both Matthew chapter 27 verse 46 and Mark chapter 15 verse 34, as he cries out these very words, expressing the deep anguish of separation from God. Psalm chapter 22 verses 7 to 8. describes how the sufferer is mocked and derided by those around him. This is reminiscent of the mockery endured by Jesus during his crucifixion as described in Matthew chapter 27 verses 39 to 43, Mark chapter 15 verses 29 to 32, and Luke chapter 23 verses 35 to 37. The graphic description of physical suffering in Psalm chapter 22 verses 14 to 18, including references to bones being out of joint, heart melting like wax, and hands and feet being pierced, bears resemblance to the physical torment experienced by Jesus during his crucifixion. Despite the intense suffering described in the psalm, it ends with a note of triumph and praise to God. This is reflected in Jesus' resurrection, where he overcomes death and is ultimately glorified. Psalm chapter 22, in light of the life and passion of Jesus Christ, it can be seen as a prophetic portrayal of the Messiah's suffering, rejection, and ultimate victory over death. The suffering of Jesus is central to Christian theology and spirituality, shaping believers' understanding of God's love, human redemption, and the meaning of discipleship. It invites Christians to reflect deeply on the mystery of suffering and the transformative power of God's grace.
Forever faithful to his covenant. Psalm chapter 89 is a reflection on the covenant that David's lineage would endure forever, and that one of his descendants would rule on the throne of Israel eternally. The psalm begins by extolling God's faithfulness and everlasting love, emphasizing his covenant with David and the establishment of his throne in perpetuity. The psalm takes a somber turn as the speaker reflects on the apparent breach of the covenant. The throne of David is depicted as in ruins, and the nation faces humiliation and defeat at the hands of its enemies. The psalmist wonders how long God will remain hidden and silent in the face of their suffering. The covenant is broken due to the nation's sin and rebellion against God. The psalm implies that the downfall of David's dynasty and the desolation of Israel are consequences of their transgressions against God's commandments. Despite the bleak circumstances, the psalmist concludes with a plea for God to remember his covenant promises and intervene on behalf of his people. The psalm ends with an appeal to God's faithfulness, righteousness, and mercy, asking for restoration and deliverance. Matthew and Luke provide genealogies of Jesus' lineage back to King David. His role as the Messiah fulfills the promise of a descendant of David ruling over an everlasting kingdom. Jesus' teachings and actions demonstrate his authority and his claim to kingship. He forgave sins, performed miracles, and exercised authority over the spiritual realm, indicating his status as the long-awaited king from the line of David. His death and resurrection are seen as the inauguration of the eternal kingdom promised in the covenant with David, where Jesus reigns as king forever.
Eternal King of unrivaled power. Psalm chapter 2 verses 1 to 12 is a royal psalm that speaks about the anointed king, who is often interpreted as a prophecy of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. The psalm speaks about God's installation of his chosen king on Zion, his holy hill. This suggests that Christ's kingship is not merely a human endeavor, but is ordained by God himself. The psalm declares that the king's authority will extend to the ends of the earth, implying a universal reign. Jesus Christ is considered the King of Kings, whose authority transcends all earthly boundaries and rulers. The psalm also addresses the opposition and rebellion against the anointed king. Despite this opposition, the psalm asserts the ultimate victory and sovereignty of the king. This reflects the challenges and opposition faced by Jesus during his earthly ministry, including his crucifixion, but also points to his ultimate triumph over sin and death through his resurrection. The psalm concludes with an exhortation to earthly rulers and people to submit to the king and serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. It emphasizes the importance of recognizing and honoring the authority of Christ as King and calls for worship and allegiance to him. Psalm chapter 89 verses 15 to 17 emphasizes the blessedness of those who walk in the light of God's presence and rejoice in his name continually. Jesus spoke about the importance of walking in righteousness, rejoicing in God's presence, and seeking his kingdom above all else. As believers rejoice in his name and walk in his ways, they experience the fullness of God's blessings and the joy of salvation found in Jesus Christ. Psalm chapter 89 verses 15 to 17 can be seen as foreshadowing the blessings and fulfillment that come through faith in Jesus Christ.
Eternal priest in the order of Melchisedek. Psalms 110:4-7 speaks about a messianic figure, interpreted as referring to Jesus Christ. Psalm chapter 110 verse 4 mentions a priesthood that is significant in the context of Christ's role as both a king and a priest, a unique combination in biblical theology. This verse highlights the uniqueness of Christ's priesthood in several ways. The Messiah's priesthood is eternal. You are a priest forever. Unlike the Levitical priesthood, which was hereditary and subject to change with the death of the priests, Christ's priesthood is everlasting. The priesthood of Christ is described as being in the order of Melchisedek. He was a mysterious figure in the Old Testament, described in Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 to 20, as a priest-king who blessed Abraham. He is depicted as a priest of the Most High God who predates the Levitical priesthood. Christ's priesthood, being likened to Melchisedek's, implies superiority and preeminence over the Levitical priesthood. As our high priest, Jesus Christ intercedes for believers before God. His priesthood grants believers access to the presence of God and assures them of God's continuous love, forgiveness, and grace. Christ's priesthood, as depicted in Psalm chapter 110, verses 4 to 7, is unique, eternal, and offers believers great hope by providing access to God, the perfection of sacrifice, a sympathetic high priest, and heavenly intercession. We can compare this with Hebrews chapter 7, verses 20 to 28. The Levitical priests were appointed without an oath, but Jesus was appointed by God with an oath. This oath underscores the permanence and unchangeable nature of Jesus' priesthood. Jesus, as the eternal Son of God, holds his priesthood permanently. There is no need for succession or replacement. Unlike repeated animal sacrifices, Jesus offered himself as the perfect and unblemished sacrifice once and for all. His sacrifice is capable of atoning for the sins of all humanity for all time. Jesus, as the eternal high priest, continues his intercessory ministry in heaven on behalf of believers. His presence before God ensures the ongoing forgiveness, advocacy, and salvation of those who belong to him. The Levitical priests were sinners who had to offer sacrifices for their own sins before interceding for the people. In contrast, Jesus is holy, blameless, and pure. His sinless nature qualifies him to serve as the perfect mediator between God and humanity. Jesus offered himself as both the high priest and the sacrificial lamb, fulfilling the roles of priest and sacrifice in one person. His sacrifice transcends the limitations of the Levitical system and brings about the redemption and reconciliation of humanity with God. The priesthood of Jesus is marked by its divine appointment, permanence, superior sacrifice, heavenly intercession, sinlessness, and ultimate fulfillment of God's redemptive plan.
Thank you for studying with us. We hope you will give this video a like
and ask you to subscribe.
and always keep the faith of Jesus.